Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome back to another tale of shadows, secrets, and the brilliant little grey cells of the world's greatest detective, Hercule Poirot. Tonight, we travel to the glittering coast of Monaco, where the Mediterranean glows silver under a full moon, and the wealthy of Europe have gathered for one night of glamour, disguise, and forgetting who they truly are. Masks conceal faces, champagne loosens tongues, and somewhere among the silk gowns and gilded masks, a killer waits. At the stroke of midnight, a toast is raised, and a millionaire falls dead before the clock finishes chiming. By morning, the masks will come off, but the truth may prove far harder to unveil than any painted face. So settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let us begin. The invitation. The Hôtel de Paris rose above Monte Carlo, like a wedding cake left too long in the sun, magnificent, slightly absurd, and impossible to ignore. On this particular evening in early June, its terraces blazed with candlelight, and from every open window drifted the sound of a small orchestra tuning itself for a night it did not yet know would end in murder. Hercule Poirot stood before the mirror in his suite, adjusting his bow tie with the meticulous care of a man performing surgery. He tilted his head this way, then that, satisfied, though never entirely satisfied, for perfection was a moving target even for a moustache as magnificent as his own. He reached for the mask laid out upon the bed. It was black, edged in gold, shaped like the face of a fox. A fox, he murmured to his reflection, with faint disapproval. They give me a fox, as though I am some sly creature who slinks about in shadows. I, Hercule Poirot, do not slink, I observe, I deduce. I arrive at the truth by the methodical exercise of order and method, not by slinking. Still, he put it on because Countess Aurelia Zanetti, his hostess for the evening, and an old acquaintance from a case in Nice some years prior, had been most insistent that no guest attend without one. A masquerade without masks, Monsieur Poirot, she had told him over the telephone, her voice rich with amusement, is merely a party. And I do not throw parties, I throw occasions. Poirot did not entirely trust people who spoke of their own gatherings with such reverence. In his experience, those who insisted most loudly on secrecy and disguise were very often the ones with the most to hide. But he had accepted the invitation nonetheless, telling himself it was merely a pleasant diversion during his holiday on the Riviera, a night of music, champagne, and the particular pleasure of watching wealthy people behave foolishly while believing themselves unobserved. He did not yet know that before the night was through, a man would be dead, and that he, Poirot, despite every instinct sharpened by 30 years of catching liars, would very nearly accuse the wrong person entirely. The ballroom, when he entered it, took his breath away rather more than he cared to admit. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across a sea of masks, birds and beasts, harlequins and devils, powdered wigs and painted lips. Somewhere beneath the silk and sequins were bankers and duchesses, actresses and arms dealers, all rendered anonymous and, for one night, equal. It was, Poirot reflected, rather like a puzzle box in which every piece had been deliberately mislabeled. Ah, there you are, my little detective. Countess Zanetti swept toward him in a gown the colour of dried blood, her own mask a peacock of impossible feathers. I was beginning to think you had abandoned me for a quieter evening with your books. Never, Madame la Comtesse, though I confess I did consider it when I saw the fox you had chosen for me. She laughed, a genuine laugh, throaty and unrestrained, and took his arm. Come, let me introduce you to tonight's cast of characters. You will find them most entertaining, or most alarming. With this crowd, it is often difficult to say which. She was not exaggerating. The first was a broad-shouldered man in a wolf's mask, drink in one hand, cigar in the other, laughing too loudly at his own jokes. Étienne Vasseur, the Countess murmured as they passed. Shipping. Half the cargo that moves through this sea belongs to him, one way or another. Charming, if you enjoy men who believe charm is something one can purchase in bulk. Poirot filed the name away, as he filed everything, quietly, precisely, without appearing to file anything at all. Near the terrace doors stood a younger woman in ivory silk, her mask a delicate bird of paradise, her eyes, visible even through the cutouts, sharp and watchful in a way that did not match the softness of her gown. Madame Vasseur, the Countess said, his wife. second wife to be precise. Younger than his daughter would have been had he ever troubled to have one. She does not look at her husband as a wife in love looks at her husband, Poirot observed mildly. No, the Countess agreed, with the particular relish of a woman who enjoyed being asked no questions and volunteering answers anyway. She does not. They moved on. A thin, nervous young man in a jester's cap hovered near the bar, drinking rather more quickly than the evening's early hour warranted. Julien Marchand, Vasseur's nephew. Sole heir, as it happens. Vasseur never remarried into children, and Julien is the last of the family line. The boy has expensive tastes and, I am told, very little money of his own to satisfy them. A common affliction, said Poirot, among nephews of rich men. Across the room, half hidden in the shadow of a marble column, a woman in a black lace mask watched the party with the stillness of someone who had trained herself not to be noticed. The Baroness Ilona Varga, the Countess said, lowering her voice slightly. Hungarian, arrived in Monaco only last season, with a great deal of jewellery and very little explanation as to how she came by it. There are rumours, but then, Monsieur Poirot, in this town, there are always rumours. Last, near Vasseur's elbow, stood a lean, precise man in spectacles and a plain black domino mask, holding a leather portfolio as though it were an extension of his own arm. Henry Dubois, Vasseur's private secretary, 10 years of loyal service, or so I am told, though I have always thought there is a particular kind of resentment that grows in men who spend a decade arranging another man's affairs while receiving none of his glory. Poirot inclined his head, taking in the tableau before him, the wife who did not love, the nephew who needed money, the Baroness with her whispered past, the secretary with his decade of quiet servitude, and at the centre of it all, Vasseur himself, roaring with laughter, utterly unaware that he stood in the eye of a storm, entirely of his own making. "You paint a most colourful picture, Madame la Comtesse," he said. "One might almost suspect you enjoy collecting people who dislike one another." "Monsieur Poirot," she smiled behind her peacock feathers, "what is a party if not that?" The orchestra struck up a waltz, and the crowd began to move, a whirl of masks and gowns, glittering and indistinct, each face as good as any other beneath the candlelight. Poirot accepted a glass of champagne he had no intention of finishing and retreated to the edge of the room, where he could watch without being watched, or so he believed. It was there, some 20 minutes later, that Étienne Vasseur approached him directly, wolf's mask pushed up onto his forehead, face flushed with wine and self-satisfaction. "You're the detective fellow, aren't you, Poirot?" His French carried the particular carelessness of a man who had never once in his life worried about being overheard. "The Countess speaks of you constantly, says you catch murderers the way other men catch trains." "I have had some small success in that direction, monsieur. Yes." Vasseur leaned closer, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes that was not drunkenness at all, but something closer to fear. "Good," he said, low and quick, "because I may need you before the night is out. There are people here who would be glad to see me dead, Monsieur Poirot. I am not a fool. I know precisely who they are." Poirot's interest sharpened, though his expression did not change. "That is a serious thing to say at a party, monsieur. It is a serious thing to know." Vasseur straightened, the mask of joviality sliding back over his face as easily as the wolf's mask over his brow. "But not tonight. Tonight I intend to enjoy myself. Tomorrow, perhaps, we shall talk properly." He clapped Poirot once on the shoulder, too hard, and moved back into the crowd, laughing again, as though he had said nothing at all. Poirot watched him go, a small frown creasing the skin above his own mask. He knows he is in danger, he thought, and yet he does nothing about it. He merely announces it, like a man testing whether the room is listening. It was, Poirot would reflect much later, the last true conversation he ever had with Étienne Vasseur. And it was, he would also reflect with some irritation at himself, a warning he had heard clearly, and had still not taken quite seriously enough. The clock on the far wall read 11:15. There were 45 minutes left before midnight. Midnight. By 11:30, the ballroom had reached that particular pitch of gaiety that precedes either triumph or disaster, and rarely anything in between. The champagne had flowed freely enough that masks had begun to slip, not from faces, but from manners. Voices grew louder, Laughter grew sharper. Secrets, Poirot had long observed, were never so carelessly handled as in the final hour before midnight, when people believed themselves already halfway to forgetting the evening entirely. He kept, as was his habit, to the edges of things. From his vantage near the terrace doors, he watched the small dramas unfold as clearly as if they had been staged for his benefit alone. Madame Vasseur, the bird of paradise, had positioned herself near the same marble column as the Baroness Varga, and though the two women exchanged no words, there passed between them a look of such perfect, practiced neutrality that Poirot found it more suspicious than open hostility would have been. Women who dislike each other, he thought, rarely stand so carefully still in each other's company. Young Julien Marchand had abandoned the bar for the card-room, where his laughter, too bright, too frequent, carried out into the hall each time the door swung open. Twice, Poirot saw him glance toward his uncle with an expression that vanished the instant Vasseur might have caught it. Henri Dubois, the secretary, had not left his employer's side all evening, moving through the crowd a half-step behind him, like a shadow that had learned to wear evening dress. He carried, still, the leather portfolio, an odd choice, Poirot thought, for a masquerade ball, unless its contents were of a nature Dubois did not trust to leave unattended, even for a single night. And Vasseur himself moved through his own party like a man conducting an orchestra only he could hear, glass in hand, Wolf's mask now abandoned entirely on a passing table, his broad face flushed and beaming, utterly unaware, or unwilling to appear aware, of the currents moving beneath the surface of his celebration. At 11:45, the Countess clapped her hands and announced, to general delight, that the traditional midnight toast would shortly commence upon the terrace, where a fountain of champagne had been arranged beneath the stars, and where, she added, with a wicked little smile, all masks must remain on until the final chime, for that is when the true magic happens. The guests began to drift outward, a slow river of silk and feathers moving toward the open terrace doors. Poirot moved with them, though something, some small, persistent unease he could not yet name, made him watch Vasseur more closely than the spectacle around him deserved. The terrace was a wide stone balustrade overlooking the harbour, strung with lanterns and crowded now with perhaps 60 guests, all facing the great fountain of champagne that had been erected at its centre, 3 tiers of crystal, glowing gold in the candlelight, guarded by 2 footmen whose sole task, it seemed, was to keep the coupe glasses filled as fast as eager hands could empty them. Vasseur took his place near the fountain itself, as host and centre of attention both, a fresh glass already in hand. Dubois hovered at his shoulder. Madame Vasseur stood some distance apart, near the balustrade, the Baroness not far from her. Julien had emerged from the card-room, flushed and unsteady, to join the edge of the crowd. The Countess raised her own glass. "Mes amis, in 1 minute, the bells of Monaco will ring in a new hour, and whatever secrets we carry beneath these masks tonight, let us drink to forgetting them, if only until dawn." Laughter, a ripple of raised glasses. Poirot, near the terrace doors, did not raise his. He was watching Vasseur's face, and it seemed to him, in that moment, that the man's earlier joviality had thinned to something more brittle. Vasseur glanced once, briefly, toward his nephew, once toward his wife. Once, longest of all, toward Dubois, who met his employer's gaze and gave the faintest nod, as though confirming some private arrangement between them. Then the bells began. 1. The crowd's chatter softened into anticipation. 2. 3. Glasses lifted higher. Somewhere, a woman laughed too loudly. 4. 5. 6. Vasseur raised his own glass toward the assembled guests, and for one unguarded instant, beneath the golden light of the lanterns, Poirot saw on his face not celebration, but something closer to relief. The look of a man who believed he had, that very evening, resolved something that had troubled him for a very long time. 7, 8, 9. He drank. 10, 11. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the stone. 12. The final chime rang out across the harbour, and in the general uproar of cheering and embracing that followed, it took several long seconds, 3, perhaps 4, though they would feel far longer in the retelling, before anyone noticed that Étienne Vasseur had not moved to embrace his wife, nor raise a second glass, nor laugh at whatever joke the moment demanded. He was on his knees. Then he was on the ground. A woman screamed, Madame Vasseur, or perhaps the Baroness. In the chaos it was impossible to say, and the crowd surged forward and back in the same confused instant, masks turning toward the fallen man, feathers and silk and gold catching the lantern light, as 60 guests became, all at once, 60 witnesses to something none of them yet understood. Poirot moved through them like a man cutting through water, reaching Vasseur's side within moments, though moments, he would later reflect with some professional irritation, had already been too many. Vasseur's face had gone the colour of old wax. His lips had drawn back from his teeth in a rictus that had nothing to do with laughter. His hand, when Poirot took it to search for a pulse, was already cooling in a manner no living man's hand should be, so soon after his heart had stopped. "Someone fetch a doctor," Poirot said, quite calmly, though his mind was already racing far ahead of his voice. "And no one is to leave this terrace." Dubois, white-faced, was the first to speak. He is dead, Monsieur Dubois." Poirot rose slowly to his feet, and as he did so, his eyes moved once, deliberately, across the frightened, glittering crowd. The wife who had not screamed until after everyone else, the nephew swaying near the balustrade, with a look that was either grief or terror, the Baroness gone very still against the stone rail, the secretary clutching his portfolio, as though it might yet save him from something. Somewhere in that ring of masks, Poirot thought, stood the person who had just killed a man in front of 60 witnesses, and no one, not one soul among them, had seen it happen. "He is dead," he said again, quieter now, almost to himself. "And I very much fear, mes amis, that his murderer is standing among us at this very moment, still wearing tonight's mask." Above the harbour, the last echo of the midnight bells faded into silence. The first threads. The doctor arrived within the half-hour. A stout, sleepy man named Percier, dragged from his bed in the town below, still buttoning his waistcoat as he knelt beside the body. It took him only a few minutes of examination to confirm what Poirot had already suspected. "Cyanide," Percier said quietly, rising and wiping his hands on a handkerchief, as though the very act of touching the corpse had left some residue he wished to be rid of. "The smell alone tells me that much. Bitter almonds, though not every nose can detect it. I would guess it was in the champagne itself, though we shall know more once the glass is examined properly. Death would have come quickly, a minute, perhaps less, from the first symptom." "Which fits," Poirot murmured, "with the timing of the midnight toast, precisely." Inspector Lucien Fontaine of the Monaco police had arrived by then as well, a narrow, humourless man who regarded Poirot's presence with the particular suspicion the official mind so often reserves for the unofficial one, though he was, to his credit, sensible enough not to object aloud to the great detective's involvement, not when the Countess herself had already made plain her wishes on the matter. "You will forgive me, Monsieur Poirot," Fontaine said stiffly, "if I conduct this investigation according to proper procedure. But of course, Inspector, I would expect nothing less. I ask only that you permit me to observe, and, where it may be useful, to offer my own small thoughts." Fontaine's expression suggested he considered Poirot's thoughts unlikely to be small in either size or frequency, but he inclined his head all the same, and the two men set about the grim business of a murder investigation, while, behind them, 60 masked guests stood shivering on the terrace in the cooling night air, forbidden to leave, and increasingly unwilling to remove their disguises, even now that the game had turned so suddenly, so horribly real. The glass itself yielded the first clue, and it was not a comfortable one. It had shattered when it fell from Vasseur's hand, but enough fragments remained, along with a faint residue at the base, for Percier to confirm what the smell had already suggested. The poison had been in the champagne, and specifically in that glass, rather than in the fountain from which it had been drawn, for 3 other guests had taken glasses from the same tier only moments before, and suffered no ill effect whatsoever. "Then it was not the fountain," Poirot said, crouching beside the wreckage of crystal on the stone terrace, turning one larger fragment carefully in a handkerchief. "It was the glass. Someone introduced the poison after it was poured, which means someone approached Monsieur Vasseur in the final moments before midnight, closely enough to tamper with what he held in his own hand." "In a crowd of 60 people," Fontaine said grimly, "all wearing masks, all pressed close together for a toast. It could have been anyone." It could have been anyone who knew he would be holding that particular glass, Poirot corrected gently, at that particular moment. Which is a rather smaller number of possibilities than 60, Inspector. Once one begins to think it through properly. He straightened, brushing off his knees, and turned his attention to the footman who had manned the fountain. 2 young men, thoroughly frightened, who swore between them that no one but themselves had touched the tiers of glasses before they were distributed. One of them, however, recalled something that made Poirot's eyes sharpen with interest. "Monsieur Dubois," the footman said, twisting his hands together. "The secretary. He took a glass from the fountain himself, perhaps 5 minutes before the bells, and he did not drink from it. He carried it away into the crowd. I noticed only because it is unusual, monsieur, for a man to take champagne and not drink it. And did you see where he went, with this glass he did not drink?" The footman hesitated. "Toward Monsieur Vasseur, monsieur. I believe he gave it to him." Henri Dubois, when questioned, did not deny it, a fact Poirot noted with some interest, for a guilty man, in his experience, was more often inclined to lie about the small, easily disprovable things than the large ones. "Yes, I brought him the glass," Dubois said, his composure returning slowly now that the initial shock had worn into something more brittle and controlled. "It is my habit at these events." Monsieur Vasseur disliked crowding toward the fountain himself. He found it undignified, for a man of his position, to be seen elbowing footmen alongside his own guests. He would ask me to bring him a glass, and I did so. Tonight was no different. "And this glass, where precisely did you obtain it?" "From the fountain. The same as anyone." Dubois' hand tightened on the strap of his portfolio. "I did not poison it, Monsieur Poirot, if that is what you are asking. I have served Étienne Vasseur for 10 years. Why would I choose tonight, of all nights, in front of 60 witnesses, to kill him?" "That," Poirot said mildly, "is precisely the question I intend to answer, Monsieur Dubois. I make no accusation yet. I merely gather the threads. A man who gathers threads too quickly into a single knot," he added, almost to himself, "often finds he has tied the wrong ends together." It was, though Poirot did not yet realize it, a warning he would have done well to heed rather more carefully than he did. For, even as he spoke the words, some small, unworthy part of his mind had already begun to settle upon Dubois as the likeliest thread of all. The secretary had carried the poisoned glass. The secretary had motive enough, if resentment after 10 years of quiet servitude ran as deep as the countess had suggested. It was, Poirot told himself, simply where the facts pointed. He did not yet stop to ask himself whether the facts had been arranged to point there deliberately. It was the portfolio that troubled him more, in the end, than the glass. "You have carried this all evening," Poirot observed, "even to a masquerade ball, where one might expect a man to leave his papers locked safely in a drawer. What does it contain, Monsieur Dubois, that you trusted it to no one but your own hands?" For the first time, something like genuine fear crossed the secretary's face. "Business papers. Nothing that concerns the police, monsieur, or you. Everything concerns me, Monsieur Dubois, when a man has died beside it." Poirot held out his hand, not unkindly, but with the particular immovability of a man who had asked a question and intended to receive an answer. "I ask you to show me." Dubois hesitated a long moment, long enough that Fontaine took a half-step closer, hand drifting toward his own authority, as though it might be needed. Before, at last, with visible reluctance, he opened the portfolio and withdrew a single folded document. It was a will. Not Vasseur's final will, filed properly with his solicitors, but a draft, dated only that week, unsigned, unwitnessed, in which Étienne Vasseur proposed to disinherit his nephew Julien Marchand entirely, and to leave the whole of his considerable fortune to a beneficiary whose name, in that first shocked reading upon the terrace, struck Poirot with genuine surprise. Not his wife, not the countess, nor any charity, nor any relation Poirot had yet heard mentioned that evening. The sole beneficiary named in the unsigned draft was Henri Dubois himself. Sons and widows. The revelation of the will did what such revelations invariably do at a gathering of frightened people. It turned suspicion, which had until then moved uncertainly among the crowd like a lost thing searching for direction, into something sharp and singular, aimed squarely at Henri Dubois. Inspector Fontaine, to his credit, did not immediately arrest the man, though it was plain from the set of his jaw that he considered the matter very nearly settled. Poirot, for his part, said nothing to discourage this belief. A small failure of candour he would later regret rather more than he cared to admit, for he told himself, not unreasonably, that a suspect who believed himself safe from suspicion would speak more freely than one who felt the net already closing. It was, he would later concede, rather more convenient a reasoning than a wholly honest one. "You did not know of this will?" Poirot asked Dubois again, once Fontaine had reluctantly permitted the questioning to continue, rather than proceeding directly to handcuffs. "I typed it, Monsieur Poirot. Of course I knew of it." Dubois' composure had cracked entirely now, his voice thin and quick. "But I did not ask for it. Monsieur Vasseur dictated it to me himself, not 4 days ago, and told me he had not yet decided whether to sign it. He said," the secretary swallowed hard, "he said he wished to see how certain people behaved themselves first." "Certain people," meaning his nephew, meaning everyone, I think. Dubois' laugh was brittle and without humour. "He enjoyed it, monsieur. The uncertainty. He liked to watch us all wonder where we stood. I did not ask to be named in that will. I did not even want it. Do you not see how it looks, now that he is dead? I would have to be a fool to kill a man over an unsigned draft that named me as heir, when the murder itself is the very thing that ensures I am immediately suspected of it." It was, Poirot privately acknowledged, not an unreasonable point. And yet men had committed greater follies than this for money, and greed did not always trouble itself with the finer points of logical self-preservation. He set the thought aside, for the moment, and turned his attention elsewhere, for a will, however suggestive, was not the only thread worth pulling. Julien Marchand, when Poirot found him, had removed his jester's cap at last and sat slumped in an armchair in the small salon adjoining the terrace, a glass of brandy, his fourth by Poirot's count, trembling slightly in his hand. "You wish to ask me whether I knew my uncle meant to cut me out of his will," the young man said, before Poirot had spoken a single word. "The whole terrace knows it by now. I saw it in their faces. Did you know, Monsieur Marchand?" "No." Julien's laugh was raw, closer to a sob than anything resembling amusement. "Is that not almost funny, Monsieur Poirot? I spent this entire evening dreading that he might do such a thing one day, and it seems he had very nearly done it already, and I did not even know enough to be properly afraid of it until after he was dead. You had debts, I understand." "Everyone has debts." Julien drained the last of the brandy and set the glass down with exaggerated care, the care of a man who did not entirely trust his own hands. "Yes, I owe money. To tailors, to card players, to men in this town who do not send polite letters when payment is late. My uncle knew it. He liked to remind me of it, in fact, whenever he wished to feel magnanimous by comparison. It amused him. And tonight, did he remind you of it tonight?" For the first time, Julien hesitated. He asked me, before the toast, whether I had considered finding honest employment. It was not kindly meant. It rarely was, with him. His eyes, red-rimmed, lifted to meet Poirot's. "I did not kill him, Monsieur Poirot. I will not pretend I loved him. I did not. And I think you are too clever a man to be satisfied if I told you otherwise. But I did not kill him." "Where were you standing, at the moment of the toast?" "Near the balustrade. I had only just come from the card-room." A pause. "Ask the men I was playing with, if you do not believe me. I did not go near my uncle's glass. I did not go near the fountain at all, after 11 o'clock. Poirot inclined his head, neither accepting nor rejecting the claim, and made a small private note to confirm it, for an alibi offered too readily was, in his long experience, worth exactly as much verification as one offered reluctantly, and not 1 grain more. Madame Vasseur received him on the terrace itself, near the very spot where her husband had died, though the body had by then been removed, and only a faint dark stain remained upon the stone to mark where he had fallen. She had removed her bird of paradise mask entirely, and beneath it her face was younger than Poirot had expected, and colder, not with grief, but with the particular stillness of a woman who has spent a great many years learning not to show what she feels. "You will ask me if I am sorry he is dead," she said, before he could begin. "I will save you the trouble of the question, Monsieur Poirot. I am not sorry. I do not think I am capable of pretending otherwise convincingly enough to satisfy a man of your reputation, so I shall not attempt it. That is refreshingly honest, madame. Honesty costs me nothing now, He is dead. What is there left to protect? She looked out over the dark harbour, the lights of moored yachts scattered like fallen stars upon the water. I married Étienne for reasons that seemed sensible enough at the time, and which I have had 4 years to regret at considerable leisure. He was not a kind man, Monsieur Poirot. He collected people the way other men collect art, for what they added to his own reflection, and no further. Did you know of the new will? No. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not grief, but something closer to bitter amusement. Though I confess it does not surprise me. It would be very like him, to leave everything to his secretary rather than his wife, simply to enjoy imagining our faces when we learned of it. He was still enjoying it, I think, even now. Where were you, madame, at the moment your husband drank from his glass? Beside the balustrade, near the Baroness. Her gaze did not waver. I did not go near him in his final minutes, Monsieur Poirot. I confess I had made something of a habit, this past year, of arranging to be as far from my husband as any social occasion would permit. Tonight was no exception. Poirot studied her for a long moment. The perfect composure, the carefully bitten-back bitterness, the honesty offered so freely it seemed almost a shield in itself. It was, he reflected, a very particular kind of performance, whether or not it was also the truth. "One thing more, madame," he said, "the Baroness Varga. You stood beside her at the toast, and yet I am told you exchanged not a single word all evening, though you stood together more than once. That is a curious kind of closeness, is it not, to remain so near a woman with whom one does not speak?" For the first time, Madame Vasseur's composure slipped, just fractionally, before she recovered it. "I do not know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot." But Poirot, who had built an entire career upon the small, fractional slips of otherwise composed people, merely smiled beneath his moustache and said nothing further, for he had learned, long ago, that the questions one chose not to press immediately were very often the most valuable ones of all. The Baroness, and a convenient truth. The Baroness Ilona Varga had, in the hour since the murder, retreated to the furthest corner of the small salon, where she sat very upright in a gilded chair, her black lace mask still in place, as though it were the only thing holding her together. "You may remove it, Madame la Baronne," Poirot said gently, taking the seat opposite her. "The game of masks, I think, has rather lost its charm for one evening." She removed it slowly, and beneath it her face was handsome rather than beautiful, marked by faint lines that spoke of a life lived with more difficulty than her jewels suggested. Her eyes, when they met his, were guarded in the manner of someone long practiced in guarding them. "You wish to know why I stood beside Madame Vasseur tonight," she said, before he had asked. "I saw your face, Monsieur Poirot, when you spoke with her. You are not a man who misses such small things." "I am rarely so fortunate, madame. Yes. I confess I am curious." She was silent a long moment, turning the lace mask over in her hands. "We are not strangers, she and I, though we have taken great care, this past year, that no one in Monaco should suspect it." A faint, humourless smile. "We knew each other in Budapest, many years ago, before either of us wore the names we wear now. I will not trouble you with the particulars. They are old and painful, and I do not think they concern your murder. But I will tell you this, I did not stand beside her tonight to conspire, Monsieur Poirot. I stood beside her because for one evening, amid all these masks and false faces, it was a comfort to stand near the one person who had known me before I became someone else entirely." It was, Poirot thought, a plausible enough explanation. Plausible in the particular way that half-truths so often were, containing just enough genuine feeling to disguise whatever remained carefully unsaid. He noted it, and did not press further, for there were other matters that evening, which seemed, to his mind, rather more urgent. "And your own relationship with Monsieur Vasseur? I am told you arrived in Monaco only last season, and yet you were invited to his wife's most intimate gathering. Vasseur wished to invest in a shipping concern in which I hold certain interests, inherited from my late husband." The Baroness's chin lifted slightly. "We had met perhaps 4 times, always on business. I had no cause to wish him dead, Monsieur Poirot, and every cause to wish him prosperous. A dead investor, I assure you, signs no contracts." It was, again, a reasonable answer. And Poirot, for reasons he would later examine with some professional embarrassment, found himself rather more inclined to believe it than the circumstances perhaps warranted, for his attention, if he was honest with himself, had already begun to drift back toward Henri Dubois, and the damning shape of that unsigned will. It was Fontaine, in fact, who delivered what seemed, that night, to be the final and most damning piece of the puzzle. Monsieur Poirot. The inspector approached with the particular brisk satisfaction of a man who believes his case has just closed itself. One of the footmen has recalled something further. He says that not 10 minutes before the toast, he saw Dubois, alone, near the fountain when he believed himself unobserved, reach into his jacket pocket and add something to a glass before carrying it away. A small vial, the footman thinks, though he did not see it clearly enough to be entirely certain. Poirot's eyebrows rose. He did not think to mention this earlier. He was frightened, monsieur. It is not every night a man watches a poisoning and realizes it only after the fact. Fontaine's satisfaction was undisguised now. It fits, does it not? The will, the glass he himself admits to carrying, and now a witness who saw him tamper with it directly. I confess, Monsieur Poirot, I do not see what further evidence we require. And here, precisely, Poirot made the misstep that he would spend the remainder of that long night, and a good portion of the following morning, quietly correcting. For it did fit. It fit almost too neatly, the motive of the will, the opportunity of the glass, and now, apparently, an eyewitness to the act itself, arriving at exactly the moment when Poirot's own suspicions had already begun to settle, comfortably and conveniently, upon Henri Dubois. And Poirot, tired from a long evening, flattered perhaps by how cleanly his own instincts appeared to have been confirmed, allowed himself, for one dangerous quarter of an hour, to believe that the case was very nearly solved. "Bring him to me," he said. "I wish to hear what Monsieur Dubois has to say for himself, now that a witness has spoken." It did not occur to him, not yet, not until rather later, when a far smaller and more troubling detail would surface and refuse to be dismissed, to ask himself a question that any properly suspicious mind ought to have asked at once. Why had this footman, who had already given one clear and detailed account of Dubois carrying an untouched glass, waited a further hour before recalling so vivid and specific a memory as a vial produced from a pocket? It was, as Poirot would later admit to himself with considerable irritation, precisely the sort of convenient, second-hand certainty that a clever murderer might arrange to have delivered, not through their own mouth, where it could be questioned and doubted, but through the mouth of a frightened servant who could not entirely be blamed for a memory that had simply, gradually, sharpened itself under the pressure of the evening's fear. But that realization was still some hours away. For now, Hercule Poirot, brilliant, meticulous, and, on this one occasion, rather more human than he cared to admit, rose from his chair, fully believing that he was about to confront a murderer, when in truth, he was about to make an accusation he would shortly be forced to withdraw. A small thing, overlooked Henri Dubois did not break easily, which was, in itself, a fact Poirot ought perhaps to have weighed more carefully than he did in that first overconfident quarter hour. "I did not touch that glass with anything but my own hand," the secretary said, over and over, his voice fraying at the edges but never once altering in its substance, even as Fontaine pressed him with the footman's fresh account, even as the word vial was repeated to him with increasing insistence. "I do not carry vials, Monsieur Poirot. Search my pockets, search my rooms, search anything you wish. You will find nothing, because there is nothing to find." Fontaine, satisfied that guilt so often protested itself in exactly this manner, ordered the search regardless. It was thorough. It was also entirely fruitless. No vial, no powder, no trace of cyanide in any pocket, any drawer, any corner of Dubois' modest room above the Vasseur villa, where a constable was dispatched within the hour to conduct as complete a search as the small hours of the morning permitted. The secretary's hands, examined closely under lamplight, showed no residue, no stain, nothing that 4 decades of criminal chemistry had taught Poirot to associate with a man who had recently handled a lethal poison. "It proves nothing," Fontaine said stubbornly, though even he could not entirely keep the doubt from his voice. "A clever man disposes of a vial quickly enough. Into the sea, into a flower bed, there are 100 places on these grounds a small glass vessel might vanish, and never be found." "That is true, Inspector," Poirot agreed slowly. "And yet," he paused, turning something over in his mind with the particular stillness that those who knew him well had learned to recognize as the true beginning of thought, rather than its idle absence. And yet a man clever enough to dispose so completely of a vial that a search of his entire room, conducted within the hour of the crime, reveals nothing whatsoever. Such a man is also, one would think, clever enough not to have handled that same vial quite so carelessly, in open view, near a fountain crowded with 60 guests, where a footman might see him do it. Fontaine frowned. "You are saying the footman lied?" "I am saying," Poirot replied, with the particular discomfort of a man forced to examine his own recent reasoning and finding it wanting, "that I have been rather too pleased, these past 2 hours, to have my suspicions confirmed so neatly by evidence that arrived rather later and rather more conveniently than it ought to have. I have allowed the shape of the case to satisfy me, Inspector, instead of asking whether the shape had perhaps been built for my satisfaction by someone other than the truth. It was, for Hercule Poirot, a rare and not entirely comfortable admission, though he made it, as he made most things, with a certain crisp economy that permitted no great wallowing in the error, only its correction. "Bring me the footman again," he said. "I wish to hear, in his own words, precisely when this new memory came to him, and, more particularly, I wish to know who he spoke with in the hour between his first account and his second." The footman, a slight, nervous young man named Georges, was considerably less composed under this second, more pointed questioning than he had been under Fontaine's earlier, gentler one. I did not lie, monsieur," he stammered, twisting his white gloves in his hands. "I remembered it. Truly, I remembered it, after I had time to think more clearly." "After you spoke with someone," Poirot said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that permitted no evasion. "Who, Georges? I do not think this memory of yours arrived to you entirely alone, in the quiet of your own reflection. Such convenient recollections rarely do." The young man's composure crumbled entirely, and it took only a further 2 minutes of gentle but relentless questioning before the truth emerged. Hesitant, ashamed, but unmistakable. "A lady," Georges admitted at last, staring at the floor. "I do not know her name, monsieur. She wore a mask, still, when she found me in the servants' passage, not an hour ago. She said she had seen the same thing I described to the inspector, and was it not strange, she said, that I had not also noticed the vial, when I had stood so close to Monsieur Dubois at the fountain. She described it to me so clearly, monsieur, the little glass bottle, the way his hand moved, that when I tried afterward to recall the moment myself, it was as though I had truly seen it. I did not mean to lie. I believed, by the time I spoke to the inspector, that I had seen it." Poirot closed his eyes briefly, less in surprise than in a kind of rueful recognition, the recognition of a trick very old, very simple, and very nearly successful. A memory, gently and skillfully suggested to a frightened, impressionable witness, could become, within the space of an hour, as vivid and certain in that witness's own mind as anything he had genuinely observed. It was not even, strictly speaking, a lie. It was something rather more dangerous than a lie, a truth manufactured so carefully that even its unwitting messenger believed it entirely. "Can you describe this lady, Georges? Anything? The colour of her gown, the shape of her mask, even the sound of her voice?" The footman screwed up his face in concentration. "A dark gown, monsieur. Green, I think, or perhaps very dark blue. It was hard to tell, in the passage light. Her mask was black lace, I believe. And her voice," he hesitated. "Her voice had an accent, monsieur. Not French. Something further east, I think, though I could not say precisely where. Black lace. An accent from further east." Poirot's mind moved at once, unbidden, to the Baroness Ilona Varga, and then, just as quickly, checked itself, for he had, not 3 hours earlier, allowed himself to be led too easily toward one convenient conclusion already, and he did not intend to repeat the error twice in a single night by leaping toward a second suspect on evidence scarcely firmer than the first. "A black lace mask is not, I think, so very rare an item at a masquerade attended by 60 guests," he said aloud, as much to himself as to Fontaine. "We will not name this lady yet, Georges. We will only remember that she exists, and that she went to some trouble, and no little skill, to see Monsieur Dubois hang for a crime the evidence no longer supports quite so cleanly as it did an hour ago." He rose, straightening his jacket, and for the first time that night allowed himself a small, private moment of genuine irritation, not at Georges, nor at the mysterious lady in the black lace mask, but at himself for having so nearly permitted the case to close itself upon the first plausible shape it offered, rather than the true one hidden somewhere beneath it. "Come, Inspector," he said aloud. "We have wasted an hour chasing the shadow someone else was kind enough to paint for us. Let us return, now, to the beginning, to the glass itself, and to the question we ought to have asked from the very first moment. Not who carried the poison to Monsieur Vasseur's hand, for that, it seems, was never truly in doubt, but who, among 60 masked guests, knew with such certainty that Henri Dubois would be the one to carry it." The shape of the crowd. By 2 in the morning, the ballroom had long since emptied of music, though not of people. The guests who were not directly implicated had been permitted, at last, to go home. But the small circle that remained, gathered now in the Countess's private salon under considerably less forgiving light than the terrace had offered, understood well enough that they were not among the fortunate. Poirot stood before the tall windows, looking out at the harbour, turning over in his mind not new facts, but old ones, rearranged. "Inspector," he said, "I wish to reconstruct, as precisely as memory permits, the exact position of every person on that terrace in the final minute before midnight. Not their alibis, their positions, where they stood, whom they stood beside, what they could see, and more importantly, what they could not. Fontaine, who had spent the better part of an hour in humbled silence since the collapse of his case against Dubois, seemed almost grateful for so concrete a task. Between them, and with the reluctant assistance of the Countess, who remembered such things with the precision of a woman accustomed to arranging seating charts for far less consequential occasions, they built it slowly, a map of silk and masks, drawn in chalk upon a small table, each guest reduced to a name and a position. Vasseur at the fountain's centre, Dubois at his shoulder, having just delivered the glass and stepped half a pace back. Julien, near the balustrade, some 15 feet distant, his account, checked now against 3 separate card players, held firm. The Baroness, further along the same balustrade. And Madame Vasseur. Poirot paused over that particular chalk mark rather longer than the others. "You told me, madame," he said, without looking up, "that you stood beside the balustrade, near the Baroness, and did not approach your husband in his final minutes. And yet," he tapped the chalk mark lightly, "the footman Georges recalls quite clearly, now that his memory has been properly untangled from the one that was planted in it, that a woman in dark silk passed close by Monsieur Dubois, only moments before the glass was delivered. Close enough, he believes, to have brushed his arm." Madame Vasseur, seated near the fire, did not flinch, but her hands, folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. "The terrace was crowded, Monsieur Poirot. Many women in dark silk passed close to many people. It was, if you recall, a party. That is true, and it would trouble me a good deal less, madame, were it not for one further small matter." Poirot straightened, and turned at last to face her directly. The black lace mask. A silence fell over the room that had nothing to do with the lateness of the hour. "I have made inquiries," Poirot continued, "of the establishment in Nice that supplied a great many of tonight's masks, including, I am told, no fewer than 4 black lace designs, identical in every particular, sold or lent to 4 separate guests of this household. One of these belonged, as we know, to the Baroness Varga. Another, his gaze did not waver from Madame Vasseur's face, was purchased, at your own request, madame, not 8 days ago, though you wore, tonight, a mask of ivory silk shaped as a bird. Where, I wonder, is its black lace twin?" For the first time since he had met her, Elise Vasseur's composure did not merely slip. It broke. "You cannot possibly," she began, and then stopped herself, visibly, with the effort of a woman drawing a curtain hastily across a room she had not meant to let anyone see into. "I do not accuse you yet, madame," Poirot said, more gently now. "I ask only for the truth of a mask, and a memory a young footman was persuaded, quite skilfully, to believe was his own. And I ask further, why a woman who claims to have felt nothing for her husband but relief at his passing should go to such trouble to shape the story of his death toward a man who had, until tonight, done her no harm at all. It was the Baroness, in the end, who broke the silence Madame Vasseur could not. "Enough," she said, rising from her chair, with the particular finality of a woman who has decided that whatever came next was preferable to watching a friend twist slowly on a hook, not entirely of her own making. Monsieur Poirot, if you mean to unravel this thread, you had better hear it whole, and not in the pieces you are presently gathering, or you will draw conclusions crueler than the truth deserves. I am listening, Madame la Baronne. She was quiet a moment, choosing her words with visible care. Elise and I knew each other in Budapest, as I told you, many years ago, before either of us had learned how heavily the world punishes women who care for each other more deeply than convention permits it to be spoken of aloud. There was a scandal, once, not of the kind that ends in newspapers, but of the kind that ends in a family's decision that a daughter must be married, quickly and far away, to a man who will never ask questions he does not wish answered. Elise's family found such a man in Étienne Vasseur. Poirot said nothing, but his eyes had sharpened considerably. Vasseur knew, the Baroness continued. Not everything, but enough. He had made it his business, over the years, to learn enough, in the particular way such men do, and to keep it always just close enough to the surface that Elise understood precisely what would happen to her, and to the memory of everyone she had ever cared for, should she ever attempt to leave him. It was not love that kept that marriage together these 4 years, Monsieur Poirot. It was a leash, and he held it very carefully, and enjoyed, I think, doing so rather more than he enjoyed anything else in his life. And when I arrived in Monaco last season, Madame Vasseur said quietly, finding her voice at last, and Étienne discovered that Ilona and I had renewed our acquaintance. However carefully, however discreetly, he made it very plain, only this week, that he intended to use it, not merely to control me further, to destroy us both publicly, should I so much as breathe a word of divorce. He told me so himself, 3 nights ago, smiling the entire time, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to threaten a woman's whole life over supper. The room had gone very still. I am not proud of what I did, Monsieur Poirot, Madame Vasseur said, and for the first time that night her voice cracked entirely. I will not insult you by pretending regret I do not fully feel for the man himself. But I did not wish Henri Dubois to suffer for it. I told myself, when I spoke to that poor footman, that I was only muddying a story already pointed his way by that dreadful will, that I was not truly building his guilt, only borrowing a little more time. I see now how thin a distinction that was. Poirot regarded her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried neither triumph nor cruelty, but only the quiet gravity of a man arriving, at last, at a truth he took no pleasure in confirming. Madame Vasseur, he said, I believe it is time you told us, from the beginning, and in full, exactly how you came to place cyanide in a glass of champagne, and precisely what part, if any, was played by the Baroness who stands so loyally beside you now. Outside, the first grey edge of dawn had begun to touch the harbour, and within the small salon, no one moved, no one spoke, as the last mask of the evening, the one Elise Vasseur had worn far longer than any piece of black lace or ivory silk, finally, fully, came away. The last mask. Elise Vasseur did not sit again. She stood by the cold hearth, one hand resting upon the mantel, as though she required something solid to hold, and told the story plainly, without the small evasions and half-truths that had coloured every previous answer she had given that night. I did not plan it for tonight, particularly, she began. I had thought of it for weeks, not with any real intention at first, only in the way one thinks of doors one does not truly mean to open. But 3 nights ago, when Étienne told me so plainly what he intended to do to Ilona's name, and to mine, should I ever try to leave him, I stopped thinking of it as a door I would not open, and began, instead, to think of how. The cyanide, Poirot said. Where did you obtain it? My husband kept it himself, Monsieur Poirot, though I do not think he ever imagined it would be turned against him. He used it, a very small quantity, kept always locked in his study, for the wasps' nests in the garden wall each summer. I have watched the gardener use it, diluted, for 3 years running. I knew where the key to that cabinet was kept, because Étienne, in his vanity, never troubled to hide such things from a wife he believed too frightened of him to ever act. And tonight? I took a small amount 2 days ago, and carried it in a scent bottle, the kind every woman at that ball carried some version of, tucked into a beaded bag, entirely unremarkable. Her hand trembled very slightly against the mantel. I did not go near the fountain myself. I knew Henri would bring Étienne his glass. He always did. It was as reliable as the tide. And I knew, too, that in the crush of the toast, with 60 people pressing close and every face hidden, no one would think twice about a woman in dark silk passing near a man for the length of a single heartbeat. "You put it in the glass after Dubois delivered it," Poirot said slowly, seeing it now, whole and entire, in the way he so preferred to see a case, not as fragments, but as a single continuous motion. "Not before. That is why the footman's original account was correct, and why no vial was ever found on Monsieur Dubois, because he never carried anything but champagne." "Yes," her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. Henri handed him the glass. Étienne turned to speak to someone. Julien, I think. Some final small cruelty before the bells. And in that moment, no more than 2 or 3 seconds, I stood close enough behind him to empty the bottle. It was very small, Monsieur Poirot. It required only a moment. And then I stepped back into the crowd and became, once more, simply a woman waiting for midnight, like everyone else. And when the footman came forward with his first accurate account of Dubois carrying an untouched glass, you understood at once how easily it might be turned into something more damning than the truth. "I did not plan that part," she said quickly, and there was, for the first time, something like genuine shame in her voice. That came later, after I understood how the will had already turned suspicion so naturally toward Henri. I told myself it was not so very great a wrong. To help a story travel a road it had already begun walking on its own. I see now that I was only trying to make a lie feel smaller than it was, so that I might carry it more easily. The Baroness, who had said nothing through this entire confession, moved at last to stand beside her, though she did not touch her, only stood close, the way, Poirot thought, she must have stood close many years ago, before either of them had learned to fear it. "I knew nothing of the poison," Ilona Varga said quietly, to Fontaine rather than to Poirot. "I swear that on whatever you wish me to swear it upon, Inspector. I knew only, tonight, when the footman's story began to point toward Henri, what Elise had likely done, not because she told me, but because I have known her long enough to recognize the particular stillness she wears when she is frightened rather than merely sad. I did not go to that footman. That much, at least, was hers alone." Poirot studied Madame Vasseur for a long moment, and there was in his expression neither the cold satisfaction of a puzzle solved nor any great softness of forgiveness. Only the tired, complicated weight of a man who had, once again, watched a case resolve itself not into a simple villain, but into a woman who had been cornered, over years, into believing murder the only door left unlocked to her. "Madam," he said at last, "I am obliged, now, to leave the remainder of this matter to Inspector Fontaine, and to the courts of Monaco, where questions of blackmail and provocation will no doubt be weighed with rather more legal precision than I am permitted to offer here. I will say only this. You did a great wrong tonight, and very nearly allowed an innocent man to bear the weight of it in your place. And that, madame, weighs rather more heavily against you, in my own accounting, than the wrong done to a husband who had, by every account I have gathered this night, made of blackmail and cruelty something of a personal art." Fontaine, who had listened to the entire confession in uncharacteristic silence, stepped forward at last to do the grim, necessary work his office required, and Elise Vasseur went with him quietly, without protest, as though some great and exhausting weight had finally, if catastrophically, been set down. Henri Dubois found Poirot alone on the terrace some time later, as the sky over the harbour had begun to pale properly into morning, gulls already calling somewhere out over the water, where the yachts sat undisturbed by the night's small catastrophe. "I do not know how to thank you, Monsieur Poirot," the secretary said, still faintly hollow-eyed, still clutching, out of habit more than necessity now, the leather portfolio that had so nearly condemned him. "An hour more, I think, and Fontaine would have—" "An hour more," Poirot said, with a candour that cost him something to offer, "and I fear I might have agreed with him, Monsieur Dubois. I will not pretend otherwise to you, when honesty is so plainly what you are owed. I allowed a case that fit together too neatly to satisfy me, before it had earned that satisfaction. It is a mistake I do not often make, and one I hope not to make again soon, but I made it tonight, and you very nearly paid the price of my error." Dubois seemed almost startled by the admission, as though he had expected from the great detective either triumphant silence or gracious dismissal, and had not anticipated this quieter, more human accounting. "Then I am glad, Monsieur Poirot, that even the finest minds are permitted an evening stumble," he said, with the ghost of a smile, "so long as they find their footing again before the dancing ends. You are kinder than the circumstance requires, monsieur." Poirot allowed himself at last the smallest answering smile. "Though I will say this in my own defence, it is rather easier to lead a tired detective astray at 1 in the morning than at any hour he has properly breakfasted. I recommend, to any future murderer who might be listening, that they plan their crimes for the daylight hours, when my faculties are considerably less forgiving." Dubois laughed, a real laugh, tired and relieved, the first Poirot had heard from him all night, and took his leave to see what remained of his employer's affairs set properly in order, will or no will, for someone, after all, would have to see to it. Poirot remained alone on the terrace a while longer, looking out over a harbour turning slowly from grey to gold. The lanterns of the previous night's celebration burned down now to soft, guttering stubs among the flowers. Somewhere below, the town of Monaco was waking to an ordinary morning, entirely unaware that in one villa above the sea, a masquerade had ended not with the removing of painted faces, but with the far slower, far more painful removal of the masks people wear simply to survive one another. The mask of the dutiful wife, the mask of the loyal secretary, the mask of the careless millionaire who had, in the end, built his own downfall as surely as any poison had. He thought, not for the first time in his long career, that murder was rarely so simple as the papers liked to make it. A villain, a victim, a tidy motive resolved by breakfast. It was, more often, a slow accumulation of small cruelties and smaller silences, until one night, beneath enough candlelight and enough anonymity, someone at last reached the door they had spent years pretending they would never open. He removed, at last, the little gold-edged fox mask he had worn the night before, still tucked, forgotten, into his jacket pocket since the small hours, and turned it over once in his hand. "A fox, indeed," he murmured, with the faintest weary smile. "Though I begin to think, mon ami, that tonight it was not I who did the hunting so cleverly after all." He set it down upon the balustrade, where Étienne Vasseur had fallen only hours before, and, straightening his jacket with his usual meticulous care, went in to find, at long last, some very belated breakfast. For even the world's greatest detective, he reflected, functioned considerably better on a full stomach than an empty one, and Monaco, whatever else the night had cost it, still made, he had heard, a very excellent cup of coffee.